et mi achi, horo yachi, et mi achi, rochen tale, et mi achi, chirich yachi, kai mi rat morchen tale.
He was the only one involved, my father. He went to the war, and when he came back from the war, like all the others of his age group, they got uneasy, and they would need more land because the parents are getting older, the crops were too small, and the livelihood was going to be very poor if they didn't do something about it. And the famous speech of Lloyd George in the House of Commons, you see, that land would be fit for heroes in the event of them coming back. And if they needed land, that estates, the nearest estate, would be broken up and made into crofts for them. And that's what happened. But they applied to the Parliament, or down to Whitehall or Edinburgh, to get land, or to get this estate broken up for them. And they were poo-pooed. They weren't denied it, but red tape would have caused great delay. So they too uneasy, and they approached. There was an election at the time, and Dr. Murray was a Liberal, and he advised them, you see, that the only way they would get this land was by raiding it. Right, there's no other way they would get it because of, as I said, of red tape. And they collected then and went up to Balranald House, where the owner of the estate lived, and told him to his face that they were going to raid his land. They needed land and they were going to take. And they started off with coming over the boundary and driving all his stock up to Balranald and marking out plots for themselves on his land. And of course he brought out an interdict against them in the Sheriff Court here in Lochmaddy, and of course that was why they went to jail. They were convicted of breach of interdict and went to jail because they would not leave the land. They refused to desist, you see, and they were convicted, which doesn't mean much, but they were convicted at the Sheriff Court in Lochmaddy and sentenced to 60 days jail without the option of a fine. Another unusual decision, but they are. And there was 14 of them in the Sheriff Court in Lochmaddy. They'd be standing room only, I take it. And when they were convicted and sentenced, like I said, they were then sent home, because there was no jail in Lochmaddy big enough to take 14 prisoners at the same time. And they eventually got word, official word, to go to Inverness of their own free will, believe it. Sounds strange, but that's the way they went. They went all the way to Inverness and walked into the jail there. And I suppose that certainly had an effect on the press at the time. They made a meal of it, and they had very, very few enemies. Most were, the whole of Scotland were on, and maybe further afield, were on their side for what they did and what was the crying shame that they were convicted, but that's beside the point. And eventually, they never served the 60 days. They served 21 days, by which time the government had stepped in and bought Balranald estate. Bought it from Balranald. He had to sell it to them. I don't know how you'd call it nowadays. And they got 8 crofts in Peebleskerry and 8 crofts in Balranald, as it is to this day. And I was brought up on one of them, number 3 Peebleskerry.
Each bilum hinyan, hinyan, hinyan. Each bilum hinyan, each mi marach. Each bilum hinyan, hinyan, hinyan. Gai mi rat mor hintale. My grandfather survived the First War, but his health was seriously compromised because he was mustard gassed in the front, we believe at the Battle of Lewes. Sadly, we now know that the officers or those in the chain of command authorised the gas, but the wind changed direction and the gas was blown back onto our own men. And I'm sure that must have happened to both sides. But this had an effect on his respiratory system. His breathing would become laboured and he was very slow in his movements. But it also had an effect on the rest of our family, because my grandmother then had to take up the burden of looking after her children and latterly her grandchildren. My beloved grandfather spent all of his life in a tent, which was perfectly adequate and comfortable for those of us who were able-bodied. But if you think of this man whose health was compromised, and particularly in the winter and the cold and the damp, it would paint a picture of what his breathing, how difficult it was for him at times. Even walking to the well to collect water, or I would often go with him into the wood to collect sticks and wood for the fire. It was a long, laborious task because we worked at his pace. He died in his mid-50s, and I have one photograph of him then, and he looked, honestly, as if he were 100. He looked older than his own parents alongside him, and that was the effect on him. I spoke recently to a woman who was a witness at his wedding. He had been married in the church in Kilmuir in Skye, and she said, I can still see him riding up on his horse and he's wearing his kilt, young and vibrant and excited. And I have replaced the picture in my heart of this old man who was burdened with this young man who she saw. And it is my prayer, many years after his death, that he now experiences the peace that passeth all understanding.